Hey guys, how are you all doing? Welcome to this week's episode. Another Tuesday, another time for me to debunk the very sneaky ways an eating disorder shows up and stays overdue in your life. In this week's episode, I want to talk about invalidation, or to be more specific, invalidation in eating disorders and in recovery. This could be you invalidating yourself or you being or feeling invalidated by others. So my core, argument or theory is that when you are invalidating yourself when it comes to your eating disorder, this is actually a way for the eating disorder to stay overdue, because your eating disorder will do everything to convince you it doesn't exist so that there is nothing for you to recover from. I believe this is the core function of self-invalidation, right? A way for the eating disorder to stay overdue. It's kind of like someone with, for instance, a drug addiction will tend to have a denial of the severity of the state of their addiction, right? Because if it was really that bad, that means that they would have to recover it, then they're kind of trivializing it. And it's so interesting how the eating disorder is always looking for reasons as to why you don't have an eating disorder. But this in itself is a symptom of the illness. It is not a sign that you don't have a problem. It is actually the opposite. It is a sign that you do have a problem, because invalidation is a symptom. So as I mentioned, in this episode, I'm going to talk about invalidating yourself, but I'm also going to talk about being invalidated. So those are two quite different things, but they can both serve the same result, which is essentially eating disorder staying overdue. Whether you are invalidating yourself or you've been invalidated with someone else, the eating disorder loves this, because that means that, oh, well, I can stay a little bit longer, right? It's like that annoying tenant that is just refusing to leave the apartment it's supposed to move out from, right? So let's get started. And let's get started talking about other people invalidating you. And this also includes healthcare professionals. This is incredibly unfortunate, but it does happen. So first of all, our society have a very skewed view of eating disorders, how they look like, who they happen to, how they manifest. Very often the stereotype is that it is a young, thin, white, female, often middle to upper class, who is refusing to eat. So an eating disorder can happen to anyone, regardless of their gender, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their socioeconomic background, regardless of their size, etc., etc. And also, just completely refusing to eat. Yes, that can be the case for some people, but for a lot of people, that's not really how an eating disorder manifests. I had anorexia. I never stopped eating. Again, some people with anorexia might just completely stop eating, but I would say this is the more rare presentation of the illness. And also, amongst eating disorders, anorexia, especially restrictive type anorexia, is actually a more rare eating disorder. Other forms of eating disorders are far more common. Very often, an eating disorder tends to manifest as a bit of a mix of different behaviors, and often it can go in cycles, right? Someone may have a very restrictive cycle, and then they have a cycle where they're binging and restricting, or binging and over-exercising, binging and purging, etc., etc. And then, everything just goes in cycles. That's very common. And also, some behaviors are spoken more about than others. People often feel more comfortable talking about their restrictive behaviors rather than, binging. That's despite the fact that binging is a pretty common behavior with eating disorders. I would actually say it's one of the most common behaviors. One of the most common manifestations is binging, or cycles of binging and then restrictive behaviors. That cycle is so common. It just manifests in different ways. And that was my cycle as well. I suffered anorexia nervosa binge purge subtype. That was my cycle. It was not like I stopped eating or didn't like food. I was obsessed with food. Are you joking me? I've never been so obsessed with food as when I was anorexic. But you can be obsessed with something and fear it at the same time. I would actually say that the fact that I did fear it made it more exciting, made it more thrilling, because it became something forbidden. I know you guys know this, but I still just want to remind you, and maybe there's someone who didn't know, but I still wanted to just get it out there. The stereotypes about eating disorders are not correct. Trust me, as someone who worked with them, it is just not correct at all. The problem with these stereotypes is that due to these stereotypes, people who present in the stereotypical way are more likely to be picked up on by the healthcare system, and therefore more likely to be diagnosed and given help, right? Which then again further reinforces the stereotype. So it's not that people who fall outside the stereotype of an eating disorder don't have eating disorders, just that they were never picked up on, they were never given the help, they were never, part of the statistic because the statistics completely ignore them. And this is just such a shame. Imagine, for instance, if you're a man and you have an eating disorder and you go to the doctor, then the doctor may, if it is an uneducated doctor about eating disorders, they might say, oh, you're fine. That is something that only happens to women and girls, right? Or it could be that they're just picking it up as something else, they, instead of an eating disorder, they think it is stress, or they think it is, passion for fitness, they pick it up differently. And this can be so invalidating for the person, because then they're thinking, well, okay, clearly then I don't have a problem. So it's like, where do I then begin? What do I recover from if I don't have a problem? But I want to remind you this. Other people's ignorance does not mean that you don't have a problem. Other people are going to be ignorant, right? That is just the truth of it. But that does not mean that you don't have an eating disorder. Like, it's kind of like, okay, imagine I'm in my house, right? And I have problems with the plumbing in my house. And I wasn't able to identify that I did. I wasn't able to identify what was wrong with the plumbing. I kind of just overlooked it because I didn't know much about it. That doesn't mean that I don't have a plumbing problem, right? It just means that I don't know anything about it and I don't know how to spot it, and then, it's just... I know that was a silly example, but I hope you understand what kind of message I'm trying to convey here. Maybe I had been taught that a plumbing problem would manifest differently. Because I don't know anything about plumbing, I kind of missed it, and now boom, everything is leaking. And I'm like, oh crap, that was not what was going to happen. And this is why falling outside of the stereotype of eating disorders can create an added danger, an added risk. And that is just your problem not being spotted, or you having to really vouch for yourself at the doctor's office rather than them just picking up what's going on. You may have to explicitly tell them that you have a problem rather than expecting them to just know, because in their heads, the problem would manifest differently. But again, this is lack of knowledge on their part. It is not a sign that you don't have an eating disorder. I don't understand Greek. That does not mean that Greek is not a language, right? It just means that I don't understand it. I can't identify it. I can hear it. I wouldn't know it's Greek, right? Just because not knowing on my end, because it's something that I haven't been exposed to or know much about, why would I know? And I know it's frustrating because a doctor should know. Yes, 100% a doctor should know. But the truth is that for a lot of doctors, especially like GPs, the training when it comes to eating disorders is minimal, absolutely minimal. For a lot of healthcare professionals, the training is it's ridiculous. It's so minimal. And some don't even get any training at all. And then their entire view on eating disorders would depend on maybe what they've seen in the media, which is also just more stereotypes, right? More stereotypes. Like, I literally have a master's degree in psychology, and the things that I've seen in my lectures touching upon eating disorders have at times been really stereotypical and wrong and just, yeah. And that is a psychology study, right? I do want to say that this does not mean that every doctor, every healthcare professional is just completely useless. There are some amazing people in the field who really, really know what they're talking about. And also some people who, even though they haven't gotten that education maybe in their studies, they're really making an effort to educate themselves and learn more. And honestly, applause to those people. I have so much respect for people who can see where maybe they have a gap in knowledge and then really seek it out. And also there are some people who may have that knowledge because they've gone through it themselves, right? Lived experience practitioners. But overall, I want to remind you that just because your healthcare practitioner, whether that is your GP, could be a therapist, could be anything, is not really validating your problems, that does not mean that you don't have a problem, okay? I sometimes wonder if practitioners avoid validating a problem because they think that if they validate it, they somehow make it worse by putting attention to it. I do not know what the logic is, but there is something strange going on there. I sometimes see this with parents as well. Parents will invalidate their children's struggles just because they feel like if they don't validate it, it doesn't exist, right? I also would argue that a lot of the eating disorder treatment is quite outdated in terms of how they measure progression in recovery, in terms of how they measure severity of the illness. A lot of it is based around, specific numbers, BMI, which is just not really capturing eating disorders accurately. Because severe weight loss and being severely underweight may be a side effect of an eating disorder in some, but not all cases. With pretty much any other mental illness, we accept that it can manifest differently, right? We know, for instance, depression can cause sleep issues, but we don't tell someone who's having severe depression but they sleep okay that they don't have depression because they don't have that one symptom, right? It could be that instead of insomnia, their problem manifested as excessive sleeping, right? Or it could be that their sleep was completely unaffected. I've been severely depressed. Sleep has never been a massive issue except oversleeping, but I've never had severe insomnia from depression. The same thing with an eating disorder. A lot of people with eating disorders struggle with exercise. I never struggle with it. I never really exercised during my eating disorder. It's just not a problem for me. It's just never really been a thing. Does that mean I don't have an eating disorder because I don't have that one symptom? Obviously, that's not what it means. And for some reason, weight has become that one symptom that people are putting a lot of emphasis on. And I'm not one of those people who say, well, it doesn't matter at all, because it is true that having a very, very low weight could come with its own medical complications, and that could affect how the eating disorder is treated, right? But someone can be very sick mentally and also physically without being underweight. And here is another thing to remember with eating disorders. It is not about being the sickest one. Like, it's not a competition of being like the best anorexic or bulimic or being the best eating disordered person, right? There is no awards here. The end goal of an eating disorder is essentially death, that is the goal for the eating disorder. The eating disorder is trying to kill you, right? And if it can't kill you, then it's trying to barely keep you alive but not have you fully living. Essentially, the goal of the eating disorder is to implement as much death as it can, either by killing you or by just turning you into a living zombie, basically. Imagine if we had this mindset with other illnesses, like, yeah, I can tell you're anxious, but are you anxious enough to have anxiety? What? I mean, maybe there are people with anxiety disorders that invalidate themselves that way, but I do find that it is with eating disorders, people are especially invalidating themselves or being invalidated. Although I would say that very often I find that a lot of the invalidation actually comes from the person suffering rather than externally. Yes, there will at times be some invalidation, and there are people who are pretty blatantly invalidated by the people around them, by the healthcare professionals, etc., etc. But also, a lot of the time, the invalidation comes from within. And also, the invalidation that comes from within also loves soaking up any kind of external invalidation. So imagine, for instance, at the start of your eating disorder, maybe you went to the GP and the GP said, oh yeah, but you look healthy, right? That comment may stick with you for a very, very long time, and it would be something that you yourself used to constantly invalidate yourself, where you're thinking, well, the doctor said this, the doctor said that. I definitely had this experience where when I first started developing my eating disorder, my family basically forced me to go to the doctor, and I was kind of in denial at that point, and the doctor was basically just did not see an eating disorder. And essentially the doctor asked me like, oh, is your family worried about, your weight loss and you not having periods? And I said, yeah, they are a bit worried. And then my doctor said, oh, tell them not to worry. It's fine. Just try not to get anorexia. I had anorexia at that point. And I'm someone who presents very stereotypically of how anorexia looked like. At that point, I was underweight. I was also, a young, white female. Again, such a textbook case of an eating disorder, yet my doctor didn't pick up on it. And I'm just thinking, if that was my experience as someone who fits the stereotype, then how on earth are people who don't fit the stereotype? What do they experience with their doctors? And thankfully, there are many doctors now, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that are able to spot eating disorders and know that they can manifest differently, right? But I just want to tell you that invalidation is common, even amongst people who are fitting the stereotypical boxes. So yeah, due to this experience, I got further ammunition for my eating disorder in telling me, actually, what I'm doing is completely normal. I do not need help. I'm fine, right? Because I used what my doctor had told me as just like this proof that confirmed my eating disorders conspiracy that I didn't really have an eating disorder. Part of me knew that, yeah, I did have a problem. Some of my behaviors were a little bit, it's a little bit off. But I was just thinking, well, my doctor said I was fine. So, but here's the thing. We cannot live our life depending on what some doctor said. If your doctor invalidate you, your doctor is going to go back home to their family and kids and live their life, right? If you are living your life with an eating disorder because your doctor told you were fine, you're going to go home with the eating disorder, right? Your doctor is going to be fine. You're the one who's going to suffer the consequences, not your doctor. Thank God in my case, when I experienced this, I eventually did get help from someone who knew about eating disorder, and they diagnosed me and they treated me, and they were like, Jesus Christ, that doctor was very wrong, But even with that comment from the doctor really stuck with me, and I also had a hard time trusting doctors after that. I had to change my doctor, and it's just, it was something that was very difficult for me, like stuck with me. So I do want to say, if you are in that situation, you have been in this situation, I have a lot of sympathy for you. I know it is difficult. But just please don't ever let someone who don't know you and what you're going through tell you that you don't struggle when you absolutely do. Honestly, it's pretty simple. If your thoughts or your actions around food, and also could be around body and exercise as well for some, that has come to a point where it's negatively affecting your life, then that is, you probably have an eating disorder, It's pretty straightforward. As literally a definition of an eating disorder is when these thoughts and behaviors come to a point where it's negatively affecting your life and your mental or physical health, or maybe both. This is a gatekeeping free zone. I don't care if you're diagnosed or what your behaviors are. If you have a problem with your relationship with food, or maybe body, maybe exercise, then you're welcome here. If you find this podcast beneficial, then chances are there is a reason for that, right? Someone without an eating disorder listen to this podcast, they wouldn't find it helpful because they wouldn't have had a problem, right? This podcast is for anyone, whether you are diagnosed with an eating disorder, whether you have an eating disorder, whether it's disordered eating, maybe you're in quasi-recovery, maybe you're like a little bit in between, don't know where you are yet. It's for you, okay? Everyone is valid and welcome here. I probably mentioned this a few times before, but I'll mention it again because I think it's quite relevant. I tend to call an eating disorder Schrodinger's illness because it will literally control your entire life whilst also telling you it doesn't exist. And how can those two things be true at once? How can something not exist yet control your life? How? Gosh, the eating disorder is so sneaky. It is so sneaky. And like I said in the beginning of this episode, it's doing this because it prevents and postpones recovery, right? Because if you don't have an eating disorder, you can't recover from it, right? There's nothing to recover from. That's what the eating disorder is doing. It's trying to normalize and rationalize your behavior to postpone recovery so that the eating disorder can stay overdue. And the eating disorder will tend to constantly look for proof that certain disordered behaviors are normal, right? So for instance, it will look at people who are dieting and think, well, this just normalizes restriction, right? It will look at people who are doing X, Y, Z, and you think because they're doing it means you should. Oh, but everyone is restricting a little bit, everyone is, going to the gym. That means that I should probably go to the gym, and it becomes this way of, where you look at what other people are doing and you start using that as like evidence that you should do those same thing. You pick out distorted behaviors in other people. Interestingly enough, the eating disorder does not tend to pick out healthy behaviors in other people in the same way. For example, maybe you have a friend that cut out carbs. You start picking up and being very interested in that behavior, but you completely ignore the fact that your other friend is loving carbs and eating lots of it. So essentially, I just call this selective mirroring. Basically, you're mirroring the behaviors that fit the eating disorder narrative and just kind of ignore the ones that fit the healthier narrative, right? For example, you have maybe a friend that goes to the gym a lot and you're very invested in this and you use this as a reason why you should go to the gym a lot, completely ignoring the fact that your other friend has not stepped their foot into a gym since 2008. Why are you picking up on the disordered behavior or quote-unquote disordered behaviors rather than the healthier ones, right? And I also want to remind you that for someone without an eating disorder, maybe that gym trip was not a disordered thing. It was just they went to the gym. But for someone with an eating disorder, if you're in recovery from an eating disorder, you notice that there is a lot of disordered thoughts and feelings around that gym trip, or maybe your body's in a space where it really needs rest. And that does not mean that just because someone else goes to the gym, you should. Health is relative. What other people do, how they move, what they eat has nothing to do with you. And even if you have a friend that is excessively restricting, excessively exercising, maintaining an unhealthy weight like below their set point, so what? Does that mean that you should do the same? No. Why would that mean that, you know? Because there's always going to be someone who have an unhealthy relationship with food, body, exercise. That doesn't mean that you should do that as well. It doesn't mean that it is okay. Another thing that I want to talk about, and this is an interesting one, right, is invalidation in recovery, right? So I spoke about just invalidation in general, invalidating yourself. Well, I don't have an eating disorder, right? My behavior is normal, right? There's another way that this can manifest, and that is actually in recovery. So basically, some people express that when they start recovery, because they are able to, for instance, challenge their fear of food or, eat the sufficient amount in recovery and actually pursue recovery actions, they convince themselves that that means that they probably didn't have an eating disorder in the first place. They're just making this up for something. And essentially, they're telling themselves, well, if I actually had an eating disorder, I wouldn't have been able to, let's say, follow my meal plan or go ahead with the necessary weight restoration or challenge this fear food. So this just shows that I never really had an eating disorder. And I don't mean to laugh to invalidate. I'm laughing because it just shows how little sense an eating disorder makes, right? Imagine if we did this approach to someone, for instance, with drug addiction. So if someone is going to rehab and going ahead with the rehab program, and actually staying clean, does that mean that they were never an addict? So if you go to an Alcoholic Anonymous meeting where people are, working towards sobriety, you see people who've been sober for 20, 30 years. Does that mean that they were never an alcoholic? Of course, that's not what it means, right? I didn't personally experience this invalidation because I did the thing in recovery without throwing a fuss. It's very interesting because I was someone who, in my recovery, it was very important for me to be a good patient, right? I did not want to disappoint my treatment team. And we can unpack that for a long time, what was behind that? Is that a good thing? But the truth is, when I eventually worked towards an increase with my treatment team, eventually I stuck with it, right? I didn't restrict. I stuck to it. I gained the weight, right? I challenged the fear foods. I did the things that we agreed to in treatment. In my case, that never made me feel like I didn't really have an eating disorder. But I've heard so many people express that that's how they feel. And that they're almost scared of expressing to that treatment team that they were able to, go ahead with the challenges or the things they agreed on, because they're scared that the treatment team will assume that they are recovered. And then scared that the treatment team will assume that, well, you don't need us anymore, and then abandon them. I think this fear of abandonment is kind of something that's laying around here. Again, I'm not talking from my own experience because I was very excited about not having to go to treatment anymore. I was like, guys, can we stop? But again, that's just me being me. But I also completely hear that for a lot of people, the thought of not having that support anymore can be scary. And they're scared that if they appear that they are more recovered, their treatment team will just assume they're recovered and stop helping them. And therefore, they need to almost act more sick towards their treatment team to make sure that they're maintaining that support. I want to remind you that the reason why you are so desperately craving the support from your treatment team is probably because you need it. If you didn't need it, why would you crave it? If you didn't need support about your food intake, then why would you crave it? The goal is to get to a point where you don't really crave that support anymore because you don't need it, right? It's funny because when I work with clients, I sometimes tell them, the goal is to get to a point where you're feeling kind of about our sessions. Do I need to do that? I have so many other things to do, right? Because essentially recovery is not a huge part of your life anymore. So sitting here talking with me about it's not really something that gives you that much anymore. But I also always make it clear, I'm not going to just abandon you or assume you don't need support because you managed to do the challenge of the week. Absolutely not. And the truth is, when I start working with someone with coaching, which is a very specific treatment approach, when I start working with someone in coaching, I expect them to follow through with the things we agreed on. And if they don't, and there is a routine of just not collaborating, I'll assume that coaching is not for them, right? I won't assume that, you did our goal, so you must be faking it. No! And the same thing goes with other forms of treatment as well. It is completely normal with eating disorders to feel, on one hand, feeling too sick to recover and then also feeling like you are not sick at all. Like, isn't that interesting, right? I hear that all the time. Someone is like, well, I think in my case, I'm too sick, I've had it for too long, or I'm too this, I'm too that. You know, there's always this belief that their situation is unique and that they cannot recover because of X, Y, Z. And don't get me wrong, I understand that some cases are more complicated than others, right? But what is so interesting is, on the other hand, the same people who may feel this way will also feel like they are not sick enough and they don't really have that bad of a problem. It's kind of like what I mentioned in the episode about why you should probably increase your intake in recovery, where I said that people with eating disorder, when it comes to increasing, a lot of people say, oh, no, I can't increase because it's too soon. And then other people say, oh, no, I can't increase because it's too late, right? The eating disorder is never going to find a happy time. And equally, your eating disorder is probably never going to reach a point where it's like fully validating you, right? Because the eating disorder is pretty invalidating. That's just how it is. Another thing that's very interesting with eating disorders is that denial of severity of the illness actually seems to be a symptom that is directly related to the state of undernourishment. This was proposed by a researcher called Dr. Sean Gussinger in Adapted to Flee Famine, the Adapted to Flee Famine hypothesis, which I really recommend you guys check out if you are someone who's very interested in eating disorder research. And it's essentially proposing that this denial of the severity of the illness was a survival mechanism. So imagine like back in the Stone Age or something, and if you were someone who was severely starving and you really were like on the verge of death from starvation, essentially what's been argued here is that being in denial over how sick you are and how undernourished you are and how much, how close to death you are essentially, is a symptom. Because essentially, if you realize, oh my God, I'm about to die, then you're going to panic, right? But essentially, denial of the severity can keep you motivated, keep you looking for food, keep you fighting back like in the Stone Age. I know that was not very well explained, but if you want to read more about this theory, definitely check out Adapted to Flee Famine Hypothesis by Dr. Sean Gussinger. It's available online. It's just incredibly interesting. I love evolutionary psychology, and I think that makes a lot of sense because I see this with eating disorder is that when people are in the thick of it, they seem to be very much in denial. And what's interesting is that as they are refeeding and going through recovery, and as they are, especially when they are fully recovered, they look back and then they realize how sick they are, sick they were. Then they're like, oh my God, how did I not see this? So it's not a general lack of insight in total, it is a lack of insight when you are in the thick of it. But then later on, you're able to see, oh God, I had a problem, right? And I think that's definitely my experience. When I was having an eating disorder, yes, I knew kind of that I had a problem, blah, 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 but I didn't realize the severity of it until I actually was recovered. And very often this tends to manifest in recovery where someone will compare where they are now in recovery with where they used to be, right? So they will be like, well, yeah, I get it, but I mean, yeah, maybe I have a little bit of a problem, but I'm not as sick as I used to be, right? I used to be that sick and now I'm just here. So I can't really be sick anymore because I'm not as sick as it was, right? Basically constantly comparing yourself to your quote-unquote worst as a way to invalidate where you are now. And the eating disorder does this so that you can stay stuck, because the eating disorder don't want you to move further towards recovery. It will tell you, well, you're not as sick as you was, you're here now, so let's just stay here, you know? So please be aware of this kind of invalidation as well. Basically looking at the fact that, oh, maybe you have been, physically or mentally at a worse stage where you are at right now, and that means that you can't be sick now. Right? But that's just silly, Of course. I mean, just because you're doing slightly better doesn't mean that you're recovered. There's a big difference between those. So yeah, overall, the key takeaway here is that invalidation is common, whether it's external invalidation from medical professionals, from those around you, or normalization of behaviors, etc., or whether it's you, invalidating yourself and really fishing for information that confirms this invalidation, right? So 9 people might tell you, yeah, you clearly have a problem. But if 1 people tell you, well, that's normal, it's fine to restrict a bit, you may really hold on to that one opinion, that one person, rather than the 10 others who told you something else. But also truth is, 10 people can tell you that, oh, it's fine to restrict a bit or tell you something ignorant. That doesn't mean they're right. And again, be aware that invalidation is a tool the eating disorder is using to stay overdue. Overall, I think that A lot of people speak about, not feeling sick enough and how how people are valid, etc., etc. But I don't think people speak that much about feeling resistance towards doing the quote unquote right things in recovery, because that makes you feel like, well, then I wasn't really sick if this is easy for me. I feel like that's something that's very common, but not that many people speak about it. But remember, that itself is a manifestation of the eating disorder. Feeling, even relief, excitement in recovery alongside the negative emotions, it is completely normal. Yes, recovery is hard, but it's not like everyone is just sitting there crying every single day and struggling constantly. Sometimes you have a day where things feel quite manageable, where you're feeling quite happy to eat a meal, right? That is normal and it's fine. I had bad days in recovery, I had good days in recovery. And the truth is, I wasn't crying before every meal. I was eating my food and then was like, well, I did that. That was not the hardest part in recovery. The hardest part in recovery for me was to, consistently challenge those sneaky thoughts and behaviors that came creeping in, and to eventually fully let go, not just of my eating disorder, but also of my recovery. It was about finding identity and purpose outside of eating disorder and eating disorder recovery. That was the most difficult part, not eating that pasta. Yeah, that was maybe difficult for some time in the beginning. And yeah, there might be people who still find that is the most difficult part. But again, that is not always how it manifests, right? It's okay to have mixed feelings in recovery. It's okay to have days where food is exciting and then it's scary. And maybe it's exciting and scary at once. It's okay where food is fun. Food can be boring. Food can be so many different things. It is all okay. It's all normal. I hope this was helpful, and now I'm gonna do a listener question. So I'm paraphrasing a bit, but this person is essentially asking, is it too late? So this is someone who's been in recovery for 2 years, is weight restored, but still experience extreme hunger, fatigue, and water retention, and never really stopped exercising. And the person is expressing that they feel like it's too late to get out of quasi recovery and do the things that you normally do, like completely resting, eating thousands of calories to be satisfied, etc., etc. So the person is asking, is it too late? I touched upon this in the episode about why you should probably increase your calories, but I'll kind of recap a bit again. Because yeah, I do advocate for rest and increased intake in early recovery. But this does not mean that it's too late. You can still get out of quasi-recovery. In fact, you really should. Because what is the option? The option would just to keep going in quasi-recovery. And that is not a space that you want to spend the rest of your life. It does not matter if you're, quote-unquote weight restored, It does not matter if you're still experiencing that you are energy suppressed in terms you might experience extreme hunger. You might still be holding on to, exercise when you know you should rest. You should still pursue full recovery. It is not too late. Me saying it's good to, increase your intake as soon as you can in early recovery. I mean, of course, refeeding syndrome is a risk, so that's the only time I would advocate for doing it a bit slowly, doing it under medical supervision. But basically me saying that, yeah, you should eat a lot and rest a lot in recovery and should do that in early recovery. That does not mean that if you didn't do that, you are now doomed to just restrict for the rest of your life. You can still increase, you can still rest, In fact, like I said, what is the alternative, right? You have not ruined it. I know that you're going to wish that, why couldn't I go back and do that from the start? Notice how that in itself is the eating disorder trying to keep you stuck where you are. Because I can promise you one thing, the people who are in those early stages, they think it's too soon to start increasing and resting. Eating disorder is never going to find a time that is good to rest and increase. It's always either it's too soon or it's too late. Like I sometimes hear even from the same person will say on 1 minute they say, it's too soon, and then they say, it's too late, right? So yeah, you can still recover. You can still pursue full recovery. You can still get out of quasi recovery. Please don't listen to your eating disorder that wants to keep you stuck in quasi forever, because it is not a place you want to stay. You got this. Keep going and keep pushing for full recovery. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed the episode. And also one thing I've noticed, A lot of you seem to find my podcast through searching on Spotify or iTunes, etc., for Recovery Podcast, as opposed to finding it on Instagram. And actually, you guys find my Instagram through my podcast, which I know for some of you is like, yeah, obviously, like that's how podcast works. But for me, I thought that was pretty cool because in the beginning, most of the people who listen to my podcast found my podcast through my Instagram. So yeah, whether you found me through Instagram or a search engine or it just popped up randomly, maybe someone shared it on their stories, I'm happy to have you here. And I hope you find this a helpful resource in your recovery. And if you don't follow me on Instagram already, you are very, very welcome to do so. I tend to put up Ask Box in my stories on Instagram at Amalie Lee or at letsrecover.co.uk. And this in this Ask Box is essentially where I take listener questions for this podcast and also topic requests or suggestions of things to talk about. Because I do really listen to you guys, what you guys are suggesting, what I can see you guys are interested in, and I try to really pay attention to that and record accordingly. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed this podcast. Have an amazing day, and remember, your eating disorder is lying to you.